Welcome to the unSeminary podcast. Are you looking for practical ministry help to drive your ministry further, faster? Have a sinking feeling that your ministry training didn't prepare you for the real world? Hey, you're not alone. Join thousands of others in pursuit of stuff that we wish they had taught in seminary. Buckle up and let's get started with this week's unSeminary podcast.
Well, hey everybody, welcome to the unSeminary podcast. My name is Rich, the host around these parts. So glad that you've decided to tune in. I know there's a lot going on in your church this week. Today we've got Jon Morrison with us. Now Jon's a little bit of a different guest. As you're going to listen in, you're going to be rewarded for tuning in today. Jon's a friend. He's a fellow Canadian. Welcome to the show, Jon.
Thanks so much, Rich. It's great to be on this side of the podcast. I've been listening for a long time now, and it's great to be a guest now. So hopefully I can add value to your listeners some way with telling my story a bit.
No, that's great. So for folks that don't know, I was born and raised in kind of central Canada, around Toronto. Jon is from the West Coast. Everybody at this part of the world just, feels jealous of them. So happy to have you here. But now, Jon, a lot of people that come on the show, they tell these amazing stories about their own personal transformation, about, I was leading a church of 4 people, and before I knew it, it was a church of 4,000. Or we raised a bunch of money and did this amazing thing. Jon actually has an interesting story that I'm hoping he'll tell. It's kind of a little bit of a personal story around his own ministry journey. I'd love to hear a little bit about that, Jon. If you could tell us kind of what has brought you to the season that you're in now.
Well, hey, that's a great question and one I'd happily tell. But I also want to say that I love those rags to riches stories because they encourage me so much. It's great to know that those things happen, and many of my friends have had the opportunity to do that. I thought we were doing that at this one church that I was at the last assignment. We saw great growth in a church that was over 100 years old, and I thought, we were putting chapters together to write a book about how to take over an established church and lead it into the 21st century. And I was very encouraged by some of the growth that we saw, new people coming, baptisms regularly. We saw debt being paid off, and then there was a bit of a vacuum in our leadership. My executive pastor got a promotion to a different place, so the district office, I guess you could call it. Mm-hmm. And that created a bit of a power vacuum in the sense that I was in a teaching pastor, executive pastor model, so a co-leadership. And then we decided, and I recommended my own basically layoff, in that I said, hey, I think we should go to a lead pastor model because I think it's more efficient. I had lots of reasons why I think the traditional model does work a little better. And the board said, yeah, we totally agree with you. In fact, we were thinking the same thing. And I was thinking, because we had all this success and, we're building up lots of momentum and excitement and there was a buzz in the church, I thought for sure that I would be the guy, to be honest with you. And then my life literally fell apart in one meeting when I heard the words search committee. And I knew that at that point my season was over. And I mean, I was thinking, did I overreact to this? Is this really happening? We had my wife was pregnant. It was Christmas was coming. I thought for sure it wasn't. But I realized that they thought I was too young to be the leader. While they liked who I was, they said it wasn't about character or sin. It was about basically me being too young to lead a church that's been over 100 years old. So that was very disheartening. And yet I see that out of it, God has used that time that I had. I got a generous severance package, which was great. We had another baby, our second baby there. So with a toddler around and a newborn, it was great to have some time away. And I also had lots of time to think, who am I as a young leader in the church? How can I still contribute? So it was never a matter of being all bitter about the church. It was actually about what can I contribute going forward from here? How can I re-engage myself as a 30-something leader in the church? So there's a long answer to a short question.
No, that's good. Was the sense, not that I want to lean in on your pain too much, but was the idea there seemed to be consensus hey, we're happy with Jon doing what he's doing when there was someone in that executive pastor role, but once that escaped, then it was whoa, wait a second, we're just not sure that that's really a winning solution.
Yeah, and in fairness to the board, they had to make a very tough decision. And so I understand that maybe they were looking for a different skill set to lead a church that was multi-generational. But at the end of the day, their decision resulted in me, not having a job anymore. So
wow.
we had to make a tough decision in response to that to say, you know what, it seems like the writing's on the wall for us here, and so we had to make the tough decision to say maybe God has something else, and so we had to leave, really close friends that we had, and now just seeking God to see what's next. But I still always want to tell the story with the positive angle, and that out of this, God has really allowed me to spend time with my family, which I value a great deal. He's allowed me to rethink some of the stuff that we'll probably talk about here, and so that I can add something with a fresh voice to a conversation that I think needs to happen in the church about how to engage with my generation, the millennial generation.
Yeah, that's cool. Why don't we jump into that? I think the obviously outside of this pastoring role, you've also you've been a blogger, an author. You've written at least one book, I think maybe two.
Yeah, two now.
Yeah, and so you sit in an interesting position to kind of sit back and say, what are the kind of trends that you're noticing in the broader church context? What are the things you're thinking about, or you're thinking we should be thinking about from your seat?
Right. Well, I think a lot of your listeners would be familiar with George Barna's recent book, The State of Pastors, where they released the Barna Research Group, which has been really eye-opening and humbling for us who grew up in the church and who are leaders in the church, to see that across North America, pastors are getting older. And so that kind of conflicts with the current population trends in North America, which say that the millennial generation is now the largest generation out there, and yet we are grossly underrepresented in church leadership. So I think in the workforce today, 1 in 3 workers is a millennial. And that's, of course, someone born between 1980 and 2000, depending on where you draw the line. But I think that's a kind of a consensus age there. So 1 in 3 in the workforce is a millennial, which is probably scary to a lot of employers. But I still think millennials bring a lot to the table. But we can get into that if you want. But only 1 in 7 pastors are under 40 in a church. And so, whatever you want to interpret with that stat, I'm sure many opinions will be out there. But it's just interesting to see that, if we are serious about passing the baton on to the next generation, then we have to be willing to take risks on, I'll just make it personal, leaders like me who, yes, have many faults and don't see the whole picture, but need to learn to be able to grow and take the leadership. So I hope that out of my pain in having people look at me and say, no, you're too young, I can say, well, actually, maybe I can raise up an army of young people who can help lead the church into the next wave, and then maybe even instill confidence in some Gen Xers or baby boomers that millennials can do a good job. We're not like the media portrays us to be, which is like lazy, narcissistic. We are those things, but we're also a lot of other good things too.
Right.
I just think it's funny that every time you see something in the news about millennials, it's always negative, right? Like I saw this one question on it was a headline. It said, "Why are millennials so obsessed with food?" And I was like, well, I think probably because we need to eat.
Yeah, because you want to get food.
Keep us alive, and so we like food. I enjoy food myself.
Nice.
But anyways, I'm just thinking, trying to rethink how we can build up trust. And so one person told me, a mentor, kind of took me under his wing for a bit, when we were in a real hurting section of life, and said, it would be very easy for you to take revenge out on these people, maybe a couple of board members that you didn't get along with that had it out for you or whatever. But he said the best revenge is a life well lived. And that is so what Paul said to Timothy too, right? Do not let anyone look down on you because you are young, but set an example, right? In the way you live your life and how you talk and how you have your faith with God. So that I don't know how that was advice, because I've been reading 1 Timothy for my whole life, right? And I love that verse about do not let anyone look down on you because you're young. And so it's right there. And so I think if I can help set an example in some ways, even someone that's been, say, quote, burned by the church. I learned that in seminary about how we're going to have a tough experience at some point. Things are going to go awry for you at one point. Everyone's going to have a scar to bear. Every pastor will carry that at one point. I had mine early. I learned that, but then to actually have to go through it and to say, I still love the church. I still believe it's the hope of the world. I still believe that lost people matter to God, and that church is his greatest vehicle to reach them.
Very cool.
I'm church camp too, right? We're both camp guys.
Yeah, exactly.
I understand camp sure helps, but churches working with camps,
Oh,
ideally.
no, absolutely. Yeah, there's nothing like the local church for sure, by any means, when it's done well. That most definitely. Why don't you give, so funny personal anecdote and all this. I was born in 1974. I'm a Gen Xer. 1974 has the dubious distinction of being the lowest birth rate year of the 20th century. So I actually,
interesting. I did not know that.
The smallest. So I was never in a portable, as throughout school, had small class sizes.
Wow.
And a lot of times I just don't run into other leaders who are my age. So as a Gen Xer.
So you're a minority, Rich. You live as a minority for your whole life.
Yeah, exactly. So, why would you say that there is hesitancy from, or why is that trend that, so few pastors or so few churches are led by folks that are millennials? Why is that?
Oh, I mean, that's a long conversation, but I think a few things is, if we do believe what the media says about millennials, then, they can't get off their phones, they show up late to work, they are addicted to porn and their social media and themselves and everything, right? But I think probably one of the biggest things that they represent a threat sometimes. I mean, I listen to some of my pastor friends who are a bit older, longer in the tooth, and they don't even know what to do with social media, right? It seems like everything has changed. And I would think that, that's kind of what like the taxi drivers feel about Uber, and that's what Christian bookstore owners feel about Amazon. And all these things have been disrupted by this huge revolution in communication and how people engage and how they what they expect, and the church to think that we're immune from it would be totally naive. So while some churches I think can get along just fine, saying we're not going to we're going to kind of hunker down and we're not going to do social media, we're not going to get engaged in all that. I think they see it as a threat, and so anybody who represents that's comfortable with it. They kind of represent social media because they're young and they are always on their phones too. And so I think, maybe I probably don't do it justice either too, because I embrace these new technologies so quickly, and I'm comfortable with them. It's kind of the air that I've breathed through those formative years of my 20s, right? Like that's when the rise of social media happened. So because I'm so comfortable with it, maybe I represent a threat to some older leaders or whatever, and people like me. But I just think it's funny, Rich, that, like all these new technologies were always made fun of, right? If you watch Downton Abbey and you see the phone come out and the butler just cannot figure out the phone, right? He just hates the phone. He's like, this thing will never catch on. Same with electricity. And then you look at when like Twitter came out and YouTube came out and Facebook came out, they all got made fun of until they were completely normal, right? So I think millennials, we get made fun of, and like I said, rightly so for many things, but soon we are going to be the ones that have to take over. So.
Totally. Well, and even just this week I was reading, I actually don't think it was launched this week. I think I was a week behind on it, but the New York Times started doing Snapchat stories, and I commented online. I was like, that is a tipping point somewhere for that particular platform. When a literally kind of old school, it doesn't really get much more staid than the New York Times. And the New York Times says, I think we need to, so I was digging into it a little bit, and they actually have 6 full-time people employed on that one application just on repurposing for, and it's interesting. You should actually, it's well worth checking out. They clearly are trying to, I think what they're trying to do is to draw people from Snapchat into their current, into their other brands. And they're trying to repackage their content to appeal to a younger generation, which is even, it's probably not even millennials they're thinking about, but it's probably even younger than that. But, I think we have to stay on the cutting edge. We have to keep asking that question. How do we continue to reach that next generation? Let's say you're, listening in and, there's leaders from maybe, one of those 40-something, 50-something leaders who's kind of caught in the middle. Ironically, I run into a lot of leaders in their 60s and even 70s who are like, I'm willing to try whatever because they've seen so much change. But there's something about, I've got a friend of mine that's a couple years older than me who will remain nameless, who is so stodgy. He's like mid-40s and he like acts like he's, 75 years old, and he's like resistant to all this. Why? What would your advice be to him? Let's say he actually comes around and says, you know what? Maybe we do need to do a few things to try to, kind of be a bit more open to reaching, millennials. What would you suggest?
Yeah, I think that's a great first, caveat to say, look, this isn't just not all people are the same age. Just because we label somebody a millennial because they're 1980 to 2000, I think that people are people, right? We know that they're loved and made by God, valued by Him, that they are fallen, and so they're going to be distracted by things that are secondary loves, like, they'll love technology or they'll love people more than God, and we'll love other things with all of our heart rather than God. So I get that. And maybe just one example before we get into that is I was at a family gathering just a few weeks ago, and I looked around the room. There was about 20 people there, and it was the boomers in the room that were on their phones, and the millennials were correcting them, saying, "Hey, whoa, no phones during family time. This is precious time here." And so it was so funny to think, you know what? Some of these issues are actually universal across, not just one thing. So when I say, like, here's how we can reach millennials, I don't even know if millennials know how to reach millennials exactly, because we're so different. I mean, I heard our friend Carrie Newhoff once say, if you bring a bunch of millennials around the dinner table and you start talking to them about what are they looking for in church, if you have 10 millennials around the table, you'll get 12 different answers. Right. And so I can only give my perspective of what has helped me.
Totally.
And so I would just say a few things like, hey, you know what, I'm an apologetics guy. I only became that because I was being asked lots of questions as a youth pastor and young adults pastor, and I was being asked these philosophical questions that I had never dealt with in Bible school, right? I learned how to preach from Romans, and I learned different theories on who wrote the book of Hebrews, and those were all great to learn, but I never learned anything about how does Christianity work with science, and working with a philosophical angle to the problem of suffering and evil. Things like, how do you deal with the book of Genesis 1, chapter of Genesis 1. So it's just really important things that are deal breakers for a lot of people, whether they be inside or outside the church. But knowing that there's an opportunity to just give a little apologetics angle. Now, I mean, May the 4th was just yesterday for us, and so we don't all have to be a Jedi in apologetics, or what we call a Jedi.
Yes.
But we do have to know something about what could the skeptic be thinking about this message that I'm giving here. And what is the person who's struggling with doubt, right? Maybe they grew up in the church, they're card-carrying believers, helping out in your youth ministry, but you don't know what they were that video that they just saw on YouTube or something that's totally throwing their faith into question just the night before. You don't know some of the stuff that they've been working through in their classroom at university or something. So just to say, like, hey, maybe you're wondering if this event ever happened, or if this is credible, what I'm saying here. Like, let's consider different perspectives. And then Tim Keller, pastor in New York, does that so well, where he just kind of addresses the skeptic or addresses the doubter. And I just think that everybody's just going to blindly believe everything that we say because we have the authority in the pulpit is just too naive, when especially reaching millennials, because I just think there's a lot of skeptics and doubters that we're engaging with and that we have in our own hearts. And that's just fourth thing before my long diatribe wraps up here. I think when I was a youth pastor and I was getting asked these questions from sincere skeptics and doubters, when I didn't have an answer for those things, they became it would be like a cancer in my soul that would slowly eat up my vibrancy, my boldness, my trust in God. So when we get asked the question, I mean, that's one thing to be talking to somebody that Jesus died for and that God loves, that he wants to reach. But to actually realize that not having an answer affects us so much.
Right.
And so it erodes our confidence in our faith. So as an apologetics guy, that's just one thing that I would take. I mean, we could, again, talk forever about having an online community and the importance of real life community, taking advantage of new opportunities and technologies, not being afraid of it. But I'll just rest there in the apologetics answer and say that would be one of my hope for pastors, is that they would realize that people are asking really tough questions inside and outside the church, and we have to love them enough to always be ready to give a reason for the hope we have in Jesus.
Are there pastors that you look to, or communicators you look to, that you think are doing because there are we had Jay Warner Wallace, friend of mine, on he's an apologetics guy, great guy
for sure.
He has an amazing apologetics ministry, does a lot of great things. He ends up becoming like a guest speaker at a lot of churches. Are there church leaders out there who you think, Tim Keller, you mentioned, does a good job kind of integrating that into the normal fabric of what he does? Are there other folks that you would suggest that do a good job at kind of weaving that into their ministry?
Well, you know what? Like, I mean, if I mention names, I think so many people know names better than I do. Do you know who the true heroes are? It would be more like the youth pastors out there, because the youth pastors are dealing with high school students.
Right.
And I mean, high schools have totally, well, maybe I shouldn't say totally. I mean, Canada's an interesting thing where we've been secular for a while now. But high schools can be a very hostile environment for the Christian, and a place where skepticism just grows vibrant, you know? So youth pastors are the ones who are calling me often, who are maybe even buying my books, ordering, and saying, hey, I'm going to do a topic, say I'm talking about suffering or something, and I need to talk, or maybe even I'm talking through Job, or I'm talking through James chapter 1, where it talks about count it all joy when you experience trials of many kinds, and I want to do something on suffering because this is the number one question my kids are asking: how could God be good in light of all this? So the heroes to me are the youth pastors and the young adults guys out there who are integrating this stuff, because they have to keep their kids interested and keep them listening. And if they don't address, you know, what the questions that they're asking, those kids will pick up their phones or tune out or not come or go to sports or do anything else other than come to youth group that night. So it's really the youth pastors, Rich, that are really impressing me, because they're realizing they need to do this if they're going to actually be relevant to the stuff that their kids are working through. And I mean, university students would be the same as well. So any young adults group out there. And if you want names, I could give you a few, but I mean, it's really the those who are trying to connect with the younger generations that are really getting this. And only because they, like me, see the need for it so bad, right?
Yeah, absolutely. For a long time, I served with, and he's still a good friend of mine, Bruxy Cavey at the Meeting House in Toronto, who every Sunday they do open forum Q&A at the end of his messages. And right, so I know important. That, what's that?
That's so important. You're right. Like, just to realize that people are going to have questions. Yeah,
absolutely. And having pinch hit a couple times there, and they do Q&A, even their guest communicators do Q&A. I know what it does for me when if we're honest, sometimes when we preach, it's like we've got this all into a nice little neat package. But if we're honest, there's this one part of it that we just kind of gloss over rhetorically.
Right.
And we're kind of hoping no one asks us a question about it. But the thing that just, and I've heard him say this, that it just, the fact that he knows that people can ask questions forces his teaching into a spot where it's like, I'm going to have to address that. Or if I don't address it, I've at least got to make sure I've got an answer, so when someone asks a question, I'm ready to to answer that.
And how many times have I closed in prayer at the end of a sermon and said, "Well, that's all that I know about that particular topic."
Yes, right, absolutely.
And so I just hope nobody asks me about it. But again, I mean, even just acknowledging that you don't know everything as a leader, like to be authentic. And to say, look, that's a great question. Why don't we look into this, or why don't you look into it, encouraging them, pointing them in the right direction.
Right.
I think that's another thing about reaching millennials. It's okay to be human.
Right.
And it's okay to admit that you make mistakes too, and to lay that out there before them. I mean, not to hang out your dirty laundry all the time, but I think people appreciate authenticity, and that's probably no surprise to many of us.
Cool. Now, you're an author as well. You've written on some of these topics. I wonder if you could kind of talk us through some of that. Tell me about, if you have a book, Clear Minds and Dirty Feet. That's a great title. Tell us about that.
Yeah, so that book came out of an experience that I had. Again, it'll probably build off my story. Is I was getting asked all these questions and didn't know the answers to them, and that actually sent me to have to resign from my job. I was in a growing young adults ministry called Ethos in Coquitlam on the west coast of Canada there, and it was going really well, and lots of momentum. We were having a lot of fun, but I found that I was woefully equipped for doing ministry. So my buddy Andy Steiger was starting a ministry called Apologetics Canada, and he needed to do a conference and we held the conference there. And in the first year, we were expecting like 100, 200 people, whatever. We got 700 Canadians in the Great Pagan North to come out to an apologetics conference.
Right.
And I thought, oh my goodness, there's a huge market for this in Canada.
Wow.
And then I looked at the speakers, and they were all Americans.
Right.
And I thought, wow, like our Canadian apologetics defense is a lot like our Canadian military defense, in that we just rely on the Americans if we're in trouble.
Yes, right.
So I was asking the question, who's training up leaders for this important issue of helping people have an answer to these really tough questions that they're asking inside and outside the church. So I had to resign. I had to sell everything, my car. I had a motorcycle even at that point. I had to sell that, everything to get tuition to go to this really cool program at Oxford University, where I got the chance to study for a year under really amazing names like Alistair McGrath, John Lennox, Ravi Zacharias came and visited us. And it was just a fantastic year. I left that and went to Biola University to finish off a master's in apologetics. And all that to say, that was important for me to really establish myself. Like, okay, I'm confident in these questions. I know it, and now I can give to others. And so I had, people giving me scholarship money. My local church had given me money, and this was just a way to say, here's a thank you. And so I wrote the book Clear Minds, Dirty Feet, with just answers to questions like, hey, how do we make sense of Christianity and science? How did that conversation go? Evidence for God's existence. Why did good God allow suffering and evil? One chapter on the philosophical answer, but another topic chapter on when someone actually is suffering, right? So C.S. Lewis writes The Problem of Pain, and it's a philosophical treatise on why God allows suffering and evil. And he loses his wife, Joy, to cancer, the love of his life, and he's a complete wreck. And so the answer that you give to somebody going through both, in a philosophy classroom is a lot different than you go with someone who just lost a loved one.
Yeah, totally.
I mean, looking at those kinds of things, and then I was able to present that to the world, or to my mom and my grandma, as a thank you for all that has been invested in my life. So Clear Minds and Dirty Feet is kind of like my apologetics treatise, which I'm happy to hawk, because I think it's just full of stuff that other people have taught me that I now am happy to pass on.
Cool. And then you're just releasing a new book here called Life Hacks. Why don't you give us a quick kind of overview of that, and then we'll move on with the rest of the episode.
Sure. Yeah, I'm happy to talk about that. When I was a youth pastor, I wrote a book to give as a gift to my grads. I was single and had lots of time and was ambitious, but also I was more just like unhappy, to say the least, about the caliber of books that you can give to grad students. I mean, like 101 Bible Promises for grads. None of my grads I knew were going to read that. Right. And just even the stuff that I would give them wasn't written for young adults. Just this is a great book, but they're not gonna. It's not addressing them. So I wrote Life Hacks with them in mind. But then, as I was kind of letting other people read it, adults would say, "Hey, this was really helpful for me. This one chapter here," or and then I talk about the church or whatever, and how you need to love the church. And they said, "Oh, I really appreciated that." And this guy was like retired, so it happened to a bigger audience. So I didn't call it like The Gift for Grads. I called it Life Hacks, just because it's something all of us need to know as we navigate through discipleship in the 21st century. So I rewrote it, and now 7 years after the fact, I'm rebranding it, re-releasing it, and I think it should be helpful for a lot of people. So
cool.
Life Hacks is a fun little project that I've enjoyed working on in this season, when I've had to kind of reimagine what ministry in my contribution evangelicalism looks like.
This is the unSeminary podcast. Stuff you wish they taught in seminary.
Well, we're going to jump into the lightning round, that part of the episode where we ask similar questions of everybody that's on the show. Today, we want to ask Jon Morrison. We're just so glad to have you on the show today. Jon, what is an online resource that you're using these days that's helping you out?
Well, one thing that's really helped me is I've had to redo my blog. So I've been blogging since 2006, got in it early, and made all the mistakes of writing too much, too long. And I mean everything. And so I've had to learn, but I've re-released it with a new platform that has been really helpful for me. I used it as a pastor. It's called Church OS. It's a web platform, but I've used it as my own personal blog. And the reason why I was able to do that is because my brother's actually the owner of the company. I was able to redo it for me. Nice. And so I really love that. My wife got me some podcasting gear for my birthday. I asked for it. My birthday is not for 4 months from now, but I asked for an early birthday present because I wanted to start that. So I've been learning, about GarageBand. So a preacher using GarageBand is kind of interesting. That's been helpful for me. And then all my books I release through a great bit of software that Rich, called CreateSpace. And CreateSpace is just Amazon's way to self-publish. So I've created a publishing company through my friend's ministry, Apologetics Canada. And so we just create Canadian resources for Canadians that otherwise couldn't, I mean, it's not like the Zondervans of the world are going to necessarily look at little minnows like me in Vancouver. So
nice.
Anyway, that's what I've been using, and it's been very helpful for me, those online resources, on top of all the other ones that, all your guests mentioned, like the Evernotes and the
right.
stuff like that. Yeah. So that's what I thought it would help me, was those tools.
That's cool. What's a book you've read in the last 6 months that's shaping your thinking or ministry?
Yeah, I had Necessary Endings by Henry Cloud handed to me, and obviously, given what I talked about in the beginning of my ministry at the last church kind of falling apart so quickly, I had to realize, like, some things are good. So we start up a lot of things, but when you start up something, you need to put something to an end. And so Necessary Endings is very helpful for me. Also, I've just been loving these two non-Christian guys. Gary Vaynerchuk, he wrote called Ask Gary V, and I was listening to a lot of Christian podcast leaders that I respect a great deal, and they kept talking about this Gary V guy, and I was just like, why don't I just listen to him, and then I'll skip whatever. So he's got a bit of a potty mouth. I call him the potty mouth prophet. Yeah. But I've just been I've learned a ton from him. He's just an entrepreneur a lot, and a guy named Pat Flynn, who many people who've started a podcast kind of use him as the way to learn what not to do and what to do, and he recommends all kinds of stuff for setting up a business, but I used him a lot for creating my podcast, the Jon Morrison podcast. So
nice. That's great. What's another ministry you're looking to that's inspiring you these days?
You should really say other than unSeminary, right?
Oh, great. Now I got to send you $20.
Well, it's just so important, right? Like, I mean, you are the guy to help leaders like me and, Canadians, but Americans as well. I know a lot of your listeners are American, but you're the guy that helps us with stuff that we didn't learn in Bible school, right? So what a great supplementary ministry to the stuff that we're, that we had learned about theology and, how to navigate your way around church life or whatever. But anyways, unSeminary is been huge for me. Obviously, Carey Nieuwhof's podcast, he's a great Canadian leader. I've sure appreciated him, and then the doors that he opened for me, like your podcast as well. And there's another Canadian guy named Brady Shearer. He has a ministry called Pro Church Tools. It's more of a business, I guess. But man, what a huge resource he is for church leaders. He's a great guy. New technology that he's got coming out, or new software, I should say, this Nucleus thing that I've been following along. So there's just so much great stuff out there, and I'm happy to contribute in some way in my own life. But it inspires me when guys like you and guys like Carey Nieuwhof, Brady Shearer, Canadian guys that I respect a lot, Andy Steiger out of Apologetics Canada, when they're doing this stuff, I think, man, I could do this too, like totally. The door's wide open, and the opportunities are all there for anybody that has some kind of ambition to do something. So love the resources that are coming out and ministries that God is using.
Cool. Well, we're going to have to jump to the last question, which is, in your personal life, when you're just looking to have fun, you want to kick back, relax, what do you do for fun?
Well, I don't know. I mean, I told you I just had a newborn, so I sleep. I try to nap as much as I can. Little Gracie was born a couple months ago, and we're just finally getting to that stage where she's sleeping a little more. I have a really gracious wife who's happy to take her a little bit more. But I also have a toddler, so when you have a second kid and the toddler comes along, dad has to step up a little more. You can't just hand the newborn to the mom anymore. You have a toddler running around. Right. But I play hockey too. I love to play hockey. I was a goalie for many years until I was about 20, and then God called me to ministry. But I love to play pickup hockey, and then I work in the yard. I just love yard work. I think as a pastor, yard work is like therapy for me, because the grass does what you want, right?
Yeah,
and
it's true.
You put the seeds in, you water it, and it grows, And so it's hard to do yard work as a Vancouverite. I don't know. You maybe some people don't know what the weather's like in Vancouver. I always say that it rained twice this year. 28 days the first time, and then 34 days the second time it rained. We had a ton of rain, so I was out in the yard yesterday thinking about you asking me this question. I was like, I love yard work. This is like play for me. So
Nice.
anyway,
That's good.
how
That's
boring
good.
is that for an answer? But that's just
No,
the
no,
reality
that's great. That's
of life.
wonderful. No, it's funny because my wife really loves yard work, and so over the years I've been a reluctant helper to her. But actually, I was just saying with her this spring that actually I think that's changed. Actually, I think I do enjoy it. It's fun. It is fun to see, and I love painting and like wall painting. Like, you know, here's a wall painted one
so
color.
rewarding, right?
And it's that same thing. It's like I've always said to people, I'm like, I love it because it's like you start at the beginning of the day, and then at the end of the day, you're done. Which not a lot of stuff in ministry has that feel to it. So
Exactly, and everything looks different.
right. Exactly.
Oh,
So, Jon, if
beautiful.
people want to get in touch with you, how can they do that, or you know, check up with your books and all that? What's the best way for them to plug in?
Yeah, I'm happy to contact anybody or connect with anybody. I have my own website that I talked about. It's jonmorrison.ca. It was a gift from my brother back in 2006, and it's continued on. And then there's a contact area there. You can just reach out to me that way, and I'd be happy to answer any questions or you know, take any advice or encouragement or anything. So that's probably the best way to do it, the easiest way. And otherwise, you know, on Twitter, I'm Jon Morrison _, and always looking to make a new Facebook friend. So you can reach out to me that way too. So
Very cool. Well, thanks so much. Appreciate you being on the show today.
thanks, Rich. It was a real pleasure. And like I said, great to be on this side of the podcast. So happy to help in any way.
Appreciate that, Jon. Have a great day.
Yeah, thanks, buddy.
Thank you for tuning in to this week's unSeminary podcast. Don't be shy. We'd love to connect. Check out unSeminary Inbox. You can sign up at unSeminary.com, and we'll send you helpful training resources every week. Plus, you'll gain immediate access to our exclusive members area with tons of resources you can use. Connect with Rich on Twitter at Rich Birch or through email rich@unseminary.com. Don't forget to check out the show notes for this episode at unseminary.com. It includes links to what we talked about today and more. Leave a comment. We'd love to hear from you. Did you enjoy today's episode? Drop by iTunes and leave a review. Thanks again for tuning in to this week's unSeminary podcast. Join us next week when we'll learn more stuff we wish they taught in seminary.